Have you ever had that feeling that history is repeating itself? Well, we're about to dive into a powerful theory that suggests it absolutely does, in these huge, predictable cycles of peace and war that literally shape the rise and fall of nations. We'll kick things off with a pretty stark warning from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. He basically declared that the world order we've all known since 1945 is done. Over. Now, this isn't just some political soundbite, it's a huge admission that we are living through a massive shift in global power. And it really begs the question, right? What comes next? All right, so here's our game plan to figure this all out. First, we'll look at why the old world is gone. Then we'll get into the main event, the big cycle of war. We're going to walk through an incredible case study, the road to World War II, see how everything spiraled out of control, and then, at the end, pull out the key lessons this cycle can teach us. So, first up, the old world is gone. And listen, this isn't about being nostalgic for the good old days. It's about recognizing that the fundamental rules of the game, the ones that have governed how countries deal with each other, have completely changed. Here's the most important takeaway. We're now in a period of, well, major disorder. According to this cycle theory, the old agreements, the institutions that used to keep the peace, they're all losing their grip. We're heading into a might is right kind of world, where raw power is what really counts. And this growing disorder brings us right to the heart of this whole explainer, the big cycle of war. It's a framework that really helps make sense of what can feel like a totally chaotic time. So, what on earth is this big cycle? Well, think of it like this. History moves in waves. You get these long stretches of peace and prosperity, but weirdly, that very success ends up creating the problems that lead to the next conflict. These conflicts build up, explode into a massive war, and that war, as terrible as it is, ends up deciding who's the new number one, what the new rules are, and boom, you get a new world order. Basically, when the laws between nations fail, the law of the jungle takes over. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. You can literally see it in the data. This chart is incredible. It shows deaths from conflict in Europe over the last 600 years, and the pattern is just crystal clear. You see these long periods of relative calm, then, bam, these enormous spikes in violence. The Napoleonic Wars, the World Wars, these are not random events. They're part of this recurring cycle. Now, a hot war, with actual shooting, it almost never comes out of the blue. It's usually the final, ugly stage of a conflict that's been brewing for years. It starts with things like trade and economic wars, then it escalates to fights over technology and who has influence around the world. Then it gets even more intense with capital wars, we're talking sanctions, freezing assets, before it finally tips over into a military conflict. To really bring this home, let's look at the most recent, and probably the most dramatic, example of this cycle playing out, the lead up to World War II. The trigger? It was the global depression after the 1929 stock market crash. You had extreme economic pain, massive gaps between the rich and the poor, and that created intense fights within countries. People were just desperate, and that desperation paved the way for populist, strongman leaders who promised to bring back order and national pride, usually through very aggressive means. I mean, Germany is the textbook case, right? Amid a mind-blowing 25% unemployment rate, Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933. A year later, democracy is dead and he has absolute power. By 1935, he's openly defying international treaties and building a massive war machine. But here's the really wild part. How did he get so much popular support? He delivered an economic miracle. His authoritarian policies created a stunning turnaround. Unemployment vanished, incomes jumped by 22%, and the stock market soared nearly 70%. For many Germans, he seemed like a savior, even as he was steering them straight towards a catastrophic war. And Germany wasn't alone in this. Japan, an island nation that lived and died by trade, was absolutely crippled when its exports got cut in half. This economic nightmare fueled the exact same turn toward militaristic nationalism. Their solution was simple. If we can't afford to buy the oil and rubber we need, well, we'll just go take it with our military. And this brings us right to the tipping point. This is that phase where all the economic warfare, the sanctions, the blockades, it all finally boils over into a full-blown hot war. As Japan got more and more aggressive across Asia, the U.S. fought back with economic weapons. In 1941, the Roosevelt administration froze all of Japan's assets, and then, this was the knockout blow, hit them with an oil embargo that cut off 80% of their supply. I mean, this move basically forced Japan into a corner. They had two choices: retreat and face national humiliation, or go to war to seize the oil they needed to survive. We all know which one they chose. Once the shooting started, governments took total control of their economies. And what's so fascinating when you look at this table is that it didn't matter if you were an allied power or an Axis power. The state told factories what to produce, they rationed what you could buy, and they controlled prices and wages. Entire economies were re-engineered from serving people to serving the war machine. And what about your personal wealth? Yeah, that wasn't safe either. A lot of countries just shut down their stock markets for a while, locking investors out of their own money. And just get a load of those tax rates. A staggering 94% top rate in the US and 98% in the UK. In a total war, your private wealth becomes secondary to national survival. Okay, this chart is the real climax of the story. It shows the financial markets acting like a real-time scoreboard for the war itself. From 39 to 42, German stocks are doing great because the Axis powers are winning. But then, everything flips at the Battle of Midway in 1942. You can see the exact moment the Allied markets, like the US and UK, begin this sustained rally, while the Axis markets just flatline and then totally collapse. It's just a brilliant illustration of how the fate of nations was reflected directly in their economies. So, what can we possibly learn from all of this? Well, this last section is all about boiling it down to the key principles for navigating these incredibly dangerous periods of change. This history offers some pretty timeless rules for survival. First, power is what ultimately matters, and you have to use it wisely. Second, the absolute most dangerous moment is when a rising power gets just strong enough to challenge the dominant one. Third, it's almost always better to find a win-win solution than to get dragged into a lose-lose conflict. But finally, if a fight is truly unavoidable, victory often goes to the side that can just endure the most pain. This quote just perfectly captures the tragic irony of it all. A stupid war is one where the cost, in lives, in money, in everything, is just way more than any possible benefit. True victory is achieving your goals without destroying yourself in the process, and yet, as we've seen, history is littered with these kinds of wars. So how does a great power avoid that kind of traumatic decline? The formula is actually pretty straightforward, even if it's not easy. You have to stay productive, you have to earn more than you spend as a country, and maybe most importantly, you have to be good enough at diplomacy to create relationships that are good for both sides, even with your rivals. And that brings us right back to today. The world order that was set up in 1945 is clearly breaking down. We've just seen the historical pattern of how these massive shifts can play out. So it leaves all of us with a really critical and, frankly, pretty unsettling question to think about. If a new cycle is underway, how close are we to its final, most dangerous stage?